and welcome to this episode of Artsibly in Conversation. My name is Diane Collin. I am a woman with short hair, blue eyes, and glasses, and today I wear a black top. Behind me are an electronic piano and white shelves with books. This series presents artists, academics, and project leaders who dedicate their time and energy to a better accessibility for people with disabilities in the arts. You can find more of these conversations on our website, artsably.com, which is spelled artsably.com. Today, Artsibly is in conversation with Dr. Eliza Chandler, Associate Professor in the School of Disability Studies at Toronto Metropolitan University. Dr. Chandler is deeply involved in disability arts and its connections to disability rights and justice. During the interview, Dr. Chandler mentions a certain number of resources that are listed on Artsibly's website in the blog section. Thank you for being here today. It's my pleasure to interview you today as part of Artsibly's podcast. I wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself to start, and also if you could provide a visual description.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. My name's Eliza Chandler, and I'm a white, noticeably disabled woman. I have short brown hair, I'm wearing glasses. Today I have on a dark sweater, and I'm sitting in a white room with nothing behind me. And I'm a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University in the School of Disability Studies, where I teach and research in the areas of disability art and cultural accessibility, and think about how disability art can represent disability in a way that resists ableist understandings.
Okay, so how did your journey into critical disability studies and culture and disability justice, how did that start exactly for you?
I did my undergrad in the early 2000s at art school at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. So I was making art, I was becoming an artist, but I wasn't identifying as disabled at all. To my knowledge, there wasn't anything called disability art. There was sort of emerging conversations in Canada, but where I was, I hadn't encountered any of that. And so I'd say in that experience, my artistic practice was quite limited by what I could do independently. There was no discussion about accommodations or accessibility, and I would sort of slyly ask people to help me in the sculpture studio or in the dark room in the photo lab. But when there was no one around to help, I would just sort of attenuate or limit my project to fit within what I could do independently, which sometimes wasn't a lot. So reflecting back on that experience, I often think about how much more I could do if I was able to sort of advocate for myself, identify as disabled, and sort of receive the accommodations that I needed. Then after that experience, I moved to Toronto, and I was looking to take some courses to upgrade my Bachelor of Fine Arts to a Bachelor of Arts, and I was able to take any course that I wanted to at the University of Toronto, and that would count towards sort of upgrading my degree. And they were starting to offer disability studies courses at that time, and I'd not ever heard of disability studies at all. And my professor at the time, and this was almost 20 years ago, I'd say, was Rachel Gorman, and I think she was just sort of starting out as well. I think she probably had just graduated from her PhD. Anyway, she was teaching a course on disability culture, and I was so captivated by that. I just thought it blew my mind right open. When I heard about the course disability studies, I really had no idea what to expect. I thought it might be medicalized or patronizing or, and not interesting, but she taught that class in such a profound way. And for me, the connection to arts and culture, which was something I was engaged in already, made all of the difference. It really helped me, get into the topic. And of course, as a disabled person, learning about disability rights and justice sort of affected how I understood myself and how I moved in the world. At the time, I was in my personal life experiencing a lot of barrier to accessing work and housing and money and stuff like that. So the course was had a profound impact on me personally and professionally. It led me to move on in my careers in disability studies at York and at OIC, U of T. And through that process of my master's and PhD, I sort of lost the arts focus. I moved more into the realm of phenomenology and storytelling and things like that. And then it wasn't until sort of one of my, near the end of my PhD program that I met up with scholar Dr. Carla Rice, who at the time was putting together digital storytelling workshops for people who identified as disabled. And I received her contact, so I just, I got in touch with her and I participated in a couple of these digital storytelling workshops. And what was incredible about these workshops is that I noticed that there were other disabled people in there using the workshop as a way to access our art supplies, artistic training, and maybe even unintentionally or surprisingly access peers of disabled artists. And again, this was sort of the late 2010, maybe very early 2010s at this point. So Tangled Art Plus Disability wasn't around. There wasn't sort of this hubbub as there is now. And so what I thought would just be sort of an interesting research project actually turned into so much more than that. It introduced me to artists like Jess Sash and Lindsay Fisher and Vanessa Dan Fletcher and all kinds of other artists. And together we sort of stuck with the project because of our investment in what we were sort of sensing was sort of an emerging disability arts culture. And at that point, we also were connected to the Abilities Arts Festival in Toronto. They had just hired a new executive director, Rena Bertelli, whose mission it was to sort of turn the organization from a parent-run one-week-long festival in the form of a charity. And Rena's objective was to turn that organization into a publicly funded, year-long, sustainable disability arts organization. And she was interested, Rena was interested in the work we were doing at Project Revision, the research project that I was mentioning with Carla Rice. So she connected with us, and over time and relationship building, I joined the board of Abilities, and just when it was turning into what it is today, Tangled Art Plus Disability. So the name change signified sort of a cultural change within the organization. And Rita is non-disabled, and it was always her intention to get the organization in a good place and then replace herself with a disabled artistic director. And that was all happening when I graduated from my doctorate. And so I applied and I became the artistic director of Tangled. And I was also at that time doing a PhD at the School of Disability Studies. So naturally it became my research agenda, my research program became about thinking about the cultural impact of disability art as I was sort of working in that realm in this other position. And from there, I've just maintained that research interest, and now I sort of have a suite of research projects that are all dedicated to supporting disability art through funding and training and mentorship, artists in residencies, things like that, as well as researching the cultural impact of that artistic production. And right now I'm interested in really sort of the emergence of cultural accessibility access practices that are created by disabled people for the cultural sphere, and thinking about how the integration of cultural accessibility across the sector, across different art organizations, can create or contribute to a real cultural shift that is about transformation rather than inclusion. So rather than including disabled people into organizations such as they are, the sort of realization that because ableism is sort of baked into our hegemony, our worldviews, everything that we do, that when we simply include people in as artists or what have you, we're still creating barriers because of how arts and culture typically work, right? So if we're inviting a disabled artist to have an exhibition in our gallery, but only giving them a weekend to install the show, potentially that can create barriers if the person's not able for any number of reasons to work that quickly. And so thinking about the impact of introducing accessible cultural accessibility practices to sort of shifting the arts culture, talking to galleries about the possibilities of extending install windows and how even if that means that you have to have fewer shows in a year, it's worth it to be able to work with disabled artists. So and yeah, so that's sort of the end of the story. That's where I am now.
And so you were telling about storytelling. How does these storytelling things impact exhibitions that you have in Tangle Arts? And can you talk a little bit more about how Tangle Arts is featuring artists?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say that since 2016, I haven't been at Tangled. I've been at TMU, but I certainly work with Tangled quite a bit, so I can speak to that maybe from a personal experience. So, for example, right, maybe where should I start with the story? So one of the shows that I co-curated before I left Tangled was with Indigenous artist Vanessa Dion Fletcher, who's a Lenape and Potawatomi artist from Takaranto, who identifies as neurodiverse, neurodivergent, and in this show, Vanessa Sorry, this show was called Own Your Cervix, and the show was about sort of the intersection of disability, identity, medical ableism, and reproductive health and rights for disabled people with cervixes in particular. But also about sort of reclaiming Indigenous identity and discovering Indigenous language. So in this show, she combined a bunch of different elements to create sort of an immersive installation. So she painted cervixes with paint that resembled her own menstrual blood, and painted the cervixes onto wallpaper, which she papered around the gallery. She built an accessible medical examining table in which people with all abilities could engage in sort of the act of self examinations of their own cervix privately, of course. She brought in a chaise lounge, which was a piece of furniture which sort of replicated or referenced, I should say, the era of sort of intense colonization in North America, and painted that as well with menstrual blood, as well as embellished the fabric with porcupine quills, which is a sacred object to her and her culture, which are used to tattoo and to create cultural objects. So she was sort of bringing in lots of different elements into the space to tell a story about how colonization has stripped her of so many things, including her language, her original language, access to cultural traditions, although she still is very connected with her culture. But interestingly, to think about the way that colonization removed Indigenous people from sacred objects as well as world views, to have this show at Tangled Art Gallery and to be thinking about disability. She was also able to think about how colonization, in particular medical care, has removed her from Indigenous ways of knowing her own body, and in so doing has introduced an experience of ableism that perhaps you wouldn't have encountered had it not been for colonization and the way that colonization shapes what we now understand as the medical industrial complex, which any disabled person will tell you sort of creates this space where doctors often don't believe disabled people when as experts of our own experience, and create barriers towards self-understanding, whether it's physical barriers like medical examination tables that we can't access, or more ideological barriers where you only are introduced to your body in this very sterile, removed way in which the doctor holds the majority of the information about your own body, and you're only given sort of snippets. And of course, the information that you're given is framed by colonial ways of knowing your body. So again, because Vanessa was, and Vanessa has talked about this too, the context of Tangled, it sort of provoked her to think about bodies and disability in the context of colonization and decolonization and Indigenous ways of knowing. So through the elements of that show, as well as the artist statement, artist talk, etc., Vanessa sort of wove this narrative and introduced audiences to sort of this perhaps often overlooked impact of medical ableism, which is sort of the separation out between the person and embodied knowledge, and through her process of self-examinations allowed us to sort of get to know or become reacquainted with ourselves in sort of this intimate way. Another exhibition I'll just talk about quickly is one that I'm working on right now with Tangled. About a year ago, I received a SSHRC grant and to do work with an artist organization in Ottawa called Being Studio. And Being Studio Being Studio is populated by artists with who identify as having developmental disabilities or neurodivergent. And they've been working together since 2002. Initially, they were operating under the name Heart of Ottawa, and then sort of later in 2017 became Being Studio. So we have a group of artists who've been working together for over 20 years at this point, and they've been collecting their artwork as well as their journals and other sort of ephemera in this huge overflowing archive. So the work that we did through this research grant was we held what we called archive sessions with a select group of artists in which we explored the art in the archive and talked about the history of Being Studio as a way of thinking about the role of developmental disabled people, including institutional survivors, in the development of disability art. Because again, disability art is a relatively newly established sector. But this group of artists had been making art, and I would argue making an impact for well before we started talking about disability art in the way that we do presently. And I often feel like some of these early contributions get overlooked when we tell stories of, he was the one to contact the Canada Council to urge them to create a funding stream, right? It's these sort of grand gestures that often get remarked upon and credited with sort of propelling disability arts to where it is today, when whole groups of artists have been working quietly for so long and making an impact. So we've created, I think, what's going to be a really compelling podcast about the history of Being Studio and its impact on the development of disability arts in Canada and its connection with institutionalization and outsider art and therapy and all of these things, and sort of thinking that in disability art currently, we spend a lot of time distancing ourselves from this historic idea that art created by disabled people is outsider art or art fruit or products of art therapy. So we distance ourselves from those narratives as a way of making a convincing case that our work is professional and it's political. But there are artists, disabled artists, who talk a lot about how their work is therapeutic, and the artists of being work in a setting that might not be recognized as a professional setting by some. And their work is very political, and they themselves talk about how their work can be political and therapeutic at the same time. And so I think it's really important to sort of surface these narratives of perhaps non-normative ways of creating disability art, which tend to fall outside of sort of the normative narrative of what a disability art practice is and can contribute. So I say all this to say, so this is what the podcast explores. And coming up next year, we'll have an exhibition at Tangled Art that features art from the archive as well as this podcast to sort of tell this hidden history of which I think is so important to the development of disability art. So again, with the artist talks, the educational panels, the tours, etc., all of those things will come together to offer a counter narrative.
And we already know where it will be published, or is that something you can already disclose? Is it on a website or?
Yeah, the podcast, when it's completed, will be published on Being Studio's website, which is beingstudio.org. It will also be featured on the podcast Disability Saves the World, which is the podcast by Dr. Fadi Shanuda, which you can find that quite easily. Yeah.
Thank you. So you mentioned now you are at TMU, at Toronto Metropolitan University.
Yeah.
And you did a postdoc there, and now you
Yeah.
are an assistant professor. What are you doing exactly there?
Yeah, now I'm an associate professor at TMU. And yeah, like I said, I'm teaching courses on disability art. I teach a course called Cripping the Arts in Canada, which I think is the first of its kind, probably one of the only courses on disability arts in Canada, and their cultural impact. I supervise graduate students working in and around the area of disability arts and culture. And my own research sort of thinks about the cultural impact of disability art, as well as sort of what we might call the necropolitical conditions in which we make disability art. So by necropolitical conditions, I mean all of the ways that disabled people's lives are threatened, either materially or ideologically, or some combination of the two. So one of the conditions or the context that I think a lot about is Canada's medical assistance in dying legislation, which makes it, as some activists will tell you, which makes it easier for disabled people sometimes to access death than it is to access life or a fulfilled life. So to think about, the ramifications of living in a culture where there's these sort of dominant narratives that to become disabled is a life not worth living. When people age into disability, as we often do, and they use that new embodiment or shift in embodiment as justification for ending a life, that sends a loud cultural narrative about the value or lack of value of a disabled life, and that translates into updates, amendments to the legislation in which people with physical disabilities, people with mental health disabilities who are not experiencing terminal conditions are able now to access medical assistance in dying. And the way that that's permissible is, again, through this ableist understanding that a life with disability is not worth living. And so, some of the saddest cases of that we hear reported is people who just for years haven't been able to find adequate, accessible housing. And perhaps they're living unnecessarily in long-term care homes. simply because it's the only place where they can access accessible housing, for example, and then being there and being, treated perhaps negligently or in ways that just don't mark a fulfilled life, and then being sort of invited to consider by physicians whether one might want to go down the road of MAID, to elect to have medical assistance in dying. And then we see people opting for this option because of the conditions of our lives, right? So we see this sense of strong message that Canada's response to ableism and the unbearable toll that it plays on disabled people in their lives is not to address ableism and create more accessible housing, to create more work options for adequate and fulfilling and well-paying work. It's not to create a basic income program. It's not to create more accessibility within public life so that people can navigate all aspects of public life as is protected in Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Instead, it is to allow disabled people to elect for death. And so, I mean, this is a really striking, a really devastating context in which we as disabled people have to live. And so creating art, which in itself is a creative engagement, which sort of confronts this idea that disabled people are non-agenda, we're not engaged. If we're making art, in fact we are all of these things. But many of the art that disabled people create sort of present disability through a new vantage, not through an ableist vantage, but through the vantage of perhaps disability pride, more affirmative vantages, or vantages of disability justice, these kinds of things. So another show that Tangled hosted a few years ago was called Flourishing, and it was curated by Dr. Catherine Frazee, who's a long-time disability rights activist and one of the strongest voices that challenge the impact of medical assistance in dying. So she curated a group exhibition featuring disabled people making artwork, and the artwork wasn't, not all of it was necessarily directly addressing MAID, but together and through her curatorial statement, it demonstrated how disabled people can flourish as was the name when given access to community, accessible spaces, the time and the right to create and that kind of thing. So I wasn't involved with that show directly, but that sort of that is a source of inspiration, and so I've been working with my colleague at the School of Disability Studies, Dr. Esther Nani, to create these. So initially we were hosting what are called death cafes, which are places where people get together and talk about death. And we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to gather together disabled people to talk about death in the context of MAID? And what we found when we initially started was people have all kinds of understandings of MAID, as is people's rights, of course. And so we were having these very disconnected conversations wherein people would defend their right to access MAID and perhaps not think about the political consequences, right? Because so often medical assistance in dying is represented as freedom of choice, when in fact, if you look at it through a disability studies perspective, we can think about again how it sort of how it is offered in place of adequate supports for living a good life. And so we wanted to introduce this context to people in our death cafes, not necessarily to teach them, you know, this is the right way to think about something, but just to introduce a perspective and see if or how or if not that changed their perspective on MAID, but again, was so often informed by a dominant discourse, which, you know, there's good reason for that. The dominant discourse is more easily accessed than a disability studies critique. But we wanted to introduce critique, but not really in a didactic way, right? We didn't want to sit people down and say, here's how we think about MAID, don't you agree, right? We wanted to sort of offer a different perspective, but in a way that people could engage with, disagree with, take up, not take up, you know, think about, ponder, those kind of things. So what we did was we started to work with disabled artists to create what we were calling short performatives, which were very sort of loosely based on some of the reading that we were doing around MAID, so that these artists would sort of create these 10-minute performances, but they would perform at the beginning of a death cafe, and it would inform the conversation. And we thought this worked really beautifully as just sort of a provocation rather than a lecture or, you know, something more didactic, as I've said. So we worked with artists to sort of create these performatives. So to give an example, there was a very famous case in Canada of this man named Archie Rowland, who was, you know, a white, wealthy man living in Quebec, had all the privilege in the world, so it's important to say that. And he was diagnosed with ALS and sent to live in a long-term care home outside of Montreal. And it was fine. He was, you know, receiving good quality of care. You know, he wasn't thrilled about his position, but you know, it was what it was. He could, you know, live a fulfilled life. And then this long-term care home closed down and he was moved to another one, and he had the opposite experience. And he started writing letters to the Montreal Gazette, sort of explaining what he was experiencing. So he would explain things like, you know, because of short staff and because of lack of resources, which we now know so much more about because of COVID, but he was writing this pre-COVID. He was saying, you know, people aren't shutting off the lights overnight, so I can't sleep. I'm not getting moved in my bed enough, so I'm getting these huge bed sores, and nobody's moistening my lips. So it seems like something you might not think about, but if you're not able to speak or to lick your lips or produce saliva, you need somebody to moisten your lips so they don't get cracked, right? So he recounted all of his sort of quotidian acts that he was experiencing. And then, you know, ultimately he said, you know, I can't bear it anymore. And the doctors are constantly suggesting that I receive medical assistance in dying, and I'm gonna take it. Like, I just can't spend my days in so much pain and so much frustration. But I really want you to know, public, through these public letters, that I'm not choosing MAID because I can't bear to live as someone with ALS. I'm choosing MAID because I'm not, the conditions are not such that facilitate a good life. And they could be, these are systemic barriers that I'm facing. And so we were quite taken by these letters. And so we worked with Sean Lee, who's a disabled artist, the director of Tangled Art Plus Disability, Carrie Perot, who's a mod artist, and Vanessa Dion Fletcher, who we spoke about earlier. And together we created this short performance in which we were talking about the importance of having our lips be moistened. And they were performing instructions, medical instructions, in which they moistened each other's lips. So it was sort of this interesting, intimate, sort of odd performance, but it provided as a way to talk about sort of a small act as a way to sort of catalyze a whole other cultural conversation about the conditions in which people are forced to take MAID as an invitation to people to think about MAID perhaps more critically. And then in the Death Cafes that followed that performance, we were able to have much different conversations based on our shared experience of that performance. So I say all that as an example of sort of the way that we can integrate disability studies perspectives on cultural events or discourses and use art to initiate different kinds of conversations around those discourses.
And there is also another project in which you're involved, which is Bodies in Translation, right? Can you talk about that project?
Yeah, so that's sort of the umbrella grant of all of this work that I'm talking about. So Bodies in Translation was a 7-year grant. We're just finishing it up now. And through, it's a partnership grant. So we had over 70, I think, partners on that grant who were artists, academic organizations, this kind of thing. And the nature of a partnership grant is that you can seed different projects in different places. So we had this whole network of people doing work like I just described, and in fact, the work that I just described was part of Bodies in Translation. It was funded through a few channels, but supported by Bodies in Translation, where we were sort of investing in disability art and thinking about how it could shift conversations about disability rights, justice, necropolitics, accessibility, etc. And we were also interested in the power of disability art to enact social change, as well as fat art, aging art, art produced through a decolonial perspective. So we had all of these sort of art sort of pilot projects going on across Canada, across Ontario really, and then teams of researchers who would follow these grants and think about, you know, be writing about them in articles and things like that. And so we produced lots of, you know, exhibitions, performances, symposia. We produced the Crooklyn Art Symposia, which happened at Harbourfront Center a few years ago, in which lots of international disability art stakeholders gathered together to talk about the future of disability arts. We had artists at residencies, you know, all of these things, and they were all very well documented. So we created podcasts and short documentaries, and you know, think pieces about all of this work that was happening. And now we're just sort of in the final stages of creating what's called a knowledge platform, which really an accessible, free to access website where we've put all of this documentation, everything from articles to documentaries, and we've created what we call learning modules around these outputs, so that people, teachers, community educators, artists, etc., can integrate these outputs, integrate the research activity of Bodies in Translation into their teaching and sort of use this work to talk about disability studies ideas, right? So they could perhaps show a video of the performatives that I was just talking about and use that performance to talk about a disability studies critique of MAID, or they could show a documentary about Vanessa Dion Fletcher's work and use that to talk about the connection between disability justice and decolonization, this kind of thing. So that was an incredible project because of sort of the range of artistic activity that we were able to cultivate. And I think in so doing, we really sort of raised the platform of disability art. One of the projects that we worked on quite a bit was around burlesque performance, which you probably know quite a bit about that as a musician, but developing like training modules again and working with concert halls, music education programs, theaters, etc., to integrate relaxed performance into their programs, and then again to follow up interviews as we go to assess the impact of introducing this cultural accessibility practice into what might be mainstream approaches to teaching and delivering the performing arts. So there's a website, bodiesintranslation.org. I think it's .org. That I would encourage anyone to go to. Let me just get the website. I should know this, but I would encourage anyone to go to. Right now, we have most of our cultural outputs on that grant. So on that website, the website is bodiesintranslation.ca. That's the website. And then soon that website will take you to what I'm describing as the knowledge platform. So you'll have access to all of the projects that were supported by the grant.
I will put a link on my on Artsibly's website. I will put a link on that.
Yeah, thank you. One other thing I'll say about the Bodies in Translation website is we also have an artist directory. So it's a sort of pages, sort of like the yellow pages where you're introduced to artists and their practice and their contact information. So if you're looking to hire or work with a disabled creative, that directory is really useful. Another thing we have on that website right now is what we call our vital practices document, which is a huge, I think, in the hundreds of pages document in which we explain how to make events accessible, how to work with live captioners, ASL interpreters, live performances, hybrid events, all of these things, and we continually update that. And so if you're interested in integrating these practices, that's a great resource to be used.
Thank you. That's great. That's exactly why Artsibly is here, is to try to connect all these initiatives that we can find here and there and try to have that and talk about it because it should be known. It's really important.
Yeah.
And I have a fond memory of Cripping the Arts. It was really transformative for me to be able to interact also with the artists and to bring friends with me and try to see their own feedback about what did you live in that experience.
Yeah.
And that was really, really important. So thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you.
So I have a last question for you. Is in your career, you've met a lot of different artists and a lot of different people. If you had one person who really inspired you to name, who would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. Oh, that's a hard one. I think I mean, I'm really fascinated by Carmen Papella, who's a blind artist working at Vancouver. And he does lots of social experiments as performances, and he thinks about how he is understood in the public culture as a blind person, and he plays with his mobility devices in really creative ways. So, for example, he has a performance, the name won't come to me, I don't think. It might just be called mobility device. But anyway, instead of walking around with a white cane, as he often does, he worked with a high school marching band, and they would follow him or surround him as he walked around the city and play musical notations to signify when an intersection was coming up, if he should turn right or left or walk upstairs or down a curb. And so there he is sort of zooming around the city, sort of taking its cues from the music. So it's such a great sort of creative exploration about world building, right? Like, what would the world look like if you were able to access the world in ways that made sense for you, which for him is auditory cues rather than a white cane, which serves really to keep him disoriented, right? He's trying, and again, this idea of like trying to access a world that wasn't built for him, and sort of the challenges that arises. But with his marching band, which of course, likely isn't sustainable, but in the interest of this performance, really sort of is a joyful, exuberant experience that we all witness. I think it is called mobility device.
Thank you. Yeah, I will. I will also put a link on that because I saw some of these videos. They're really well done. And people don't realize at first what is happening. And yeah, it's a great artist. I really like that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This is fun. Thank you.
And all the best for all your projects and everything that is happening right now.
Okay, you too. Good luck with our ability. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.